bring in my guests, and I'm looking forward to this conversation, actually, because I'm super curious on his take. I'm joined with Jeff Rich. Jeff Rich is an author, historian, podcaster who worked for 33 years in government. Now retired, he currently lives in Melbourne, Australia. Jeff has spent a lifetime of studying history and how knowledge of historical currents can help give context to the changing world. You can follow Jeff on YouTube at The Burning Archive and find him on Substack at jeffrich.substack.com. And it's that last part that I want to talk about. Jeff, how you doing today? You doing okay?
I'm doing great, Jamal. I've had a really good day, even though world events are a little bit scary right now. But yeah, I actually had a chat earlier today with one of the favourites of your viewers, KJ No, about
Did
the election in
you?
South Korea. Yeah.
Did
So
you?
people should check that out on my YouTube channel, Burning Archive
KJ is
YouTube channel.
fantastic.
And
Yeah.
so KJ was fantastic, and we talked about. I should stop shaking the camera, really, shouldn't I? But
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That's me. I
no,
think I might be doing that.
we talked about the election in South Korea, the new president, and what the implications might be for the geopolitics of the
Yeah, that's
world
called
and the
U.S.
region.
overreach. That's called U.S. overreach. They did everything in their power to get that puppet in office. And then that
Yeah,
puppet, out of the blue, decided we're
yeah,
having a martial law.
yeah,
It was like on a
yeah,
Tuesday, just a random day.
yeah,
And people are
yeah,
like, what? And, God bless the people of South Korea. I mean, they were throwing their
yeah.
bodies on the line to protect their parliament on that one. No, KJ is fantastic, man.
Yeah.
Um, what I would like to talk to you about is video that you did.
Hmm.
So there's a gentleman, I think his last name is Orloff, and he often talks about what he saw during the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
And Ted Roth, who was apparently over there during the collapse, also talks about, I mean, he was on the show at one point talking about what he saw during the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
You did a show recently where you were saying effectively the West is in for a shock when it
Hmm.
fails. That basically, with all sorts of self congratulatory ideas about itself, Europe is a
Hmm.
garden, all this
Yeah,
stuff,
yeah,
this notion that we have the right to lead the world, all of these ideas that don't really line up to reality, especially if you're looking at the context of 5,000 years or more, where you get countries like Iran, China, Russia, et cetera, like these long term countries that have maintained their cultural identity
mm,
over thousands of years, whereas the US is a flash in the pan. Europe
mm,
has been fighting wars back and forth. I mean, even to the point of destroying the world twice, with the attempt now to try to do it again under this idea of this hegemonic control of the globe.
mm.
And you were pointing out, I can't think of the gentleman's book, but you were pointing
Yeah,
out
it
that the
was
book,
Emmanuel Todd, The Defeat
that's
of
it,
the West.
Emmanuel Todd.
Yes. Yeah.
Emmanuel Todd. I was fascinated by that. Orloff points out some of the similar themes
Mm,
that we are going to be in for a shock. And it's
mm,
going to be a shock in a way that is different than what took place in the Soviet Union when it collapsed, because the
mm,
Soviet Union had all sorts of, let's say, things that underpinned some of the worst aspects of it that we don't have here in the States, and they don't necessarily, or at the very least, might be getting rid of in Europe in order to pay more money for defense. Give me your
mm.
take on that. You did a really good breakdown of it. I kind of want to step into it.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, the idea is well, it's partly mine because a couple of years ago I did write a piece which I think was called "The Grand Illusions of the West in Ukraine," which was
Yeah.
comparing the elites, I guess, of the West to the elites of the aristocratic elites of Europe in
Mhm.
prior to World War One, and the sort of there was a great film about World War One by I think it was Jean Renoir called The Grand Illusion, which is sort of displays this sort of collapsed world where they can't quite believe that the world that they've commanded aristocratically for years has sort of fallen apart in the trenches of World War One. But the idea is more from Emmanuel Todd, who's a French historian who wrote a book called The Defeat of the West, or actually La Défaite de l'Occident, because he wrote it in French and it hasn't yet been translated into English. And but Emmanuel Todd recently gave a lecture in Hungary and also in Russia, and has recently himself set up a Substack, and he's translated both of those lectures, which basically contain the main ideas of his book and subsequent reflections on, where things are at. And the thing about Emmanuel Todd, it contains them in English, so you don't have to, rely
Translate.
on my dodgy translations. You can actually read his own translation. So he argues in these recent pieces that effectively the West has been defeated in strategically in the conflict in Ukraine. Defeated because it hasn't been able to win on the battlefield, defeated because it hasn't been able to win economically, and that many times in history, military defeat can have the consequence of a revolution. So that's what happened in the French Revolution to some degree. That's what happened in 1917 in Russia, in 1918 in Germany, in 1917, 1918 in the former Austria-Hungarian Empire. And to some degree, it's also, I guess, what happened in the Soviet Union in 1991. Although
Afghanistan.
I think but the military defeat, the Afghanistan dimension, I think in my reading, the best historian of this, Vladislav Zubok, really says it's really other reasons rather than military defeat which causes the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's a whole other discussion which we touched on the other week. But so he interprets the Trump revolution as a post-defeat response, a sort of to quote Steve Bannon, the primal scream of a dying regime. Steve Bannon's show, I'm sure your viewers are probably sensible enough not to spend their time, too much of their time listening to Steve Bannon, but I do occasionally dip into Steve Bannon just to see what he's thinking, I guess, or to see what that band of opinion is thinking. And he has these, this soundbite of him saying, it's the primal scream of a dying regime, talking about, I don't know, Joe Biden or something. I don't know. But I actually think Steve Bannon and a lot of the noise, like J.D. Vance's speeches, and a lot of the stuff we're hearing out of the US government at the moment can be described as the primal scream of a dying regime. Pete Hegseth is the primal scream of a dying regime.
That is
But yeah,
funny.
so there is this sense, and so the shock is, and this is where the Soviet comparison, the collapse of the Soviet Union comes in, because Emmanuel Todd actually made a prediction in the fairly early 1970s that the Soviet Union would collapse based on he's basically a demographer, like studies, population trends and things like that.
Mhm.
So what he'd observed was there was a significant decline in infant mortality, and he, on the basis of that, made a argument that the Soviet Union would collapse. Now, I'm not 100% sure it collapsed for the reason that he predicted the collapse, but nonetheless he did. And he was reflecting in his lecture on that collapse and said he had no idea that the collapse of the Soviet Union would be so traumatic, so much suffering, so difficult. And what partly made it difficult was it wasn't just an economic collapse, it wasn't just a political collapse. It was a collapse of a belief system, a collapse in socialism, communism, and a
State
very
religion. Yeah.
rapid and enthusiastic embrace of Western liberalism, which kind of betrayed the Russian people, perhaps, and all the other post-Soviet states. But and he says that there's something similar going on now, that the military defeat in Ukraine is provoking this sort of primal scream of a dying regime amongst the elite, the imperial elite, both in Washington and or in the United States and also in Europe. And he sees them as being, I guess, servants of that US regime, and with it also a collapse in the sort of ideology of empire, a collapse in the belief system around empire. So it's a sort of demoralized, confused, dislocated elite who really just don't know what they're doing and are very, very confused. And so that's the kind of shock that he's talking about. And, at some point, people, people are going to have to realize the dreadful mistake that they've made and face the reality, I guess. And, I guess last few days have perhaps reinforced that as well.
The primal scream of a dying regime is the funniest thing I've heard today.
Yeah.
Primal scream. I guess in my head, the primal part is like an animal, like an ape screaming at the top of his lungs at the brink of death.
Yeah.
That is.
It came up partly because I was just checking. I wonder what Steve Bannon's going to have to say about Korea, kind of thing. And I just heard this, and he just, he and his various guests were just going on this bizarre rant about China, and that Korea is now China has the new Korean president's a CCP puppet, and half the American government's actually controlled by the CCP, and all this sort of.
They are insane with that stuff. I mean, even nonsense. With the Elon Musk thing, because it's weird, right? Like 20% of what Steve Bannon said, you could be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then he says stuff like that goes into Alex Jones territory. And it's like, okay, dude. So Obama and Trump both were trying to do the Asian pivot, but what? They're controlled by the Chinese CCP. Yeah. I mean, it makes no sense at all. Yeah. When he talks about Ukraine thing, though, it does make sense. And I give you an example with that. When he points out, he says Trump should walk the F away. That was the first thing Bannon said when Trump got elected. Walk the F away. Don't get involved. He says, I don't even care if you do investigations, just walk away. Yeah. Well, Trump didn't do that. And even after this attack that recently took place, Spider's Web, and Bannon was like, and again, I don't even know why he's confused about this. From my point of view, the U.S. is intimately involved in what that attack was in these terrorist attacks that are going over in Russia right now. And Bannon is like, it's weird. Donald Trump looks like, he should say something if he's not involved, or otherwise he should walk away. And it's like, dude, what are you not paying attention to? Like, he's the president of the United States. And it gets to that very specific thing of when you become either president of the US or you are, let's say, head of Britain, the sun never sets on the British Empire. It has set. It not just set, it has not risen again. And yet they still walk in this idea that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Like, there's a mindset that goes along with it. It's not just military might. It's not just economic might. There's a mindset that comes along with that thinking that is, it's like a horse with blinders on. They don't see a lot of the stuff. And so it's like, for Trump, can a US president walk? Technically, yes. But could he? Like, what is the media going to say? What is his political cronies going to say? What are the people who he put into these, these neocons that he put into his administration? What are they going to say? Like, Trump has been able to manage a huge amount of relative control over his instruments politically. But that is, no person gets the power by themselves. And, there's a belief that he can't do this walk, even though he can absolutely walk. Trump is, as you pointed out, Trump is but orthodoxy across the board. Whether it's economic, where he decided he's having a trade war against the world, okay, that totally bucks this idea of globalism. Whether it's I'm going to negotiate with Putin, okay, that totally bucks the orthodoxy that was taking place in the Democratic and Republican Party in regards to Russia. On China, he seems to be consistent. On Iran, he's consistent. But on many of these other priorities, not so
Well,
much.
you see, I mean, I think this crisis post the spiderweb operation, like John Helmer's talking about an Oreshnik moment where, Russia has to make a decision as to whether it, you know,
Instill
it
seriousness into the
seriously
conversation. Yeah,
escalates to really force the issue, I guess, in some way. And it certainly appears at this point that they're not immediately going that course. And I think I heard him have John Helmer, that is, talk about this earlier today, and he's saying that in a sense his interpretation of the phone call between Putin and Trump is that Putin would have said, "Well, if you genuinely want to negotiate with me, you're going to have to prove you can actually deliver pretty soon in some sort of way." And I think this is forcing a real crisis of competence, actually, in the United States government, because, I mean, there would be three things that speaking as a former government official, just sort of objectively saying, if you're, wanting to negotiate with another government about an issue, what are we going to actually have to work out here in assessing your capability to negotiate an agreement with you? And one is going to be, well, do you have the authority to control your proxies and allies?
right.
And either you don't because they've just gone rogue on you, or or
Or you're involved.
yeah, or you're involved. So there's that issue, and I think that is perhaps the most crucial thing for Russia right now, because I think if Russia can actually get Trump to exercise some authority to constrain, Britain, Ukraine, and the European Union, but principally I think Ukraine and Britain, because a lot of people are speculating, MI6 is involved in this operation as well, and say that MI6 have a significant role in the Ukrainian
They
government
do.
right now.
Yeah.
So if they can actually constrain those parties in terms of what they do, then clearly that will be beneficial, I guess, for Russia in terms of both negotiations and military situation.
I don't see the
And
point. Like I, I
well,
don't I don't get this appeasement strategy to frankly the notion that you're believing an enemy
yeah,
after the Minsk agreements 1 and 2, after the Istanbul agreements,
yeah,
Donald
yeah,
Trump
yeah,
is still Donald Trump signed a mineral deal where he's
yeah.
effectively selling weapons to Ukraine and pretending that he has nothing to do with the Ukrainian war. This is of course nonsense.
Yeah, yeah. Look,
And so it's like,
absolutely, absolutely, and that goes to, I guess, to the other points. One of which is, well, are you actually agreement capable? Okay, so, if you say something to me, will you deliver it? And I think all the evidence Russia would have to has accumulated over a long time, since at least 1991, and certainly since 2014, or even since early 2022, is that no, the United States is not agreement capable in that sense. So I think that they probably said, well, you have to. That's the test you have to prove, but they're saying we know you're going to fail. And
yeah,
then the other test would be about your intentions. So, are you seriously negotiating an end to the war or a peace agreement with us? Because we see all this sort of double game going on, and we don't need intelligence services to tell us your government is not one all singing from the same hymn sheet. They're
Right.
sort of all over the place, and part of the problem with the American empire, given its astonishing worldwide range and size, and the peculiar fragmentation of the United, as a former bureaucrat, the United States government is astonishingly fragmented. All governments have a problem, coordinating policy and getting coherence across multiple agencies and all this sort of thing. But the United States is at another level. And it's also at another level because there are so many private sort of interest type players involved as well. I mean, it's a military industrial complex. There's the Elon Musks, there's all the think tanks, there's all the sort of people sort of roped in from everywhere to play different roles.
Yeah.
So it's just chronically divided. So the capacity to any negotiating party is going to say, I've no idea what your intentions are. You're all over the place, and there's so much capacity for people lower down the food chain to still be in command of operations, to still be in command of resources, to still be in command of a microphone in front of a camera, and go off half-cocked, or go off without telling the president, or just play the usual, like most cabinets, top levels of government, the divisions within the top level of government are more bitter than the divisions with their opponents often. They're not always publicly displayed,
Yeah.
but they often are there. It's not, it's not a game for it's a very conflict-ridden thing with people with enormous egos and competing objectives. What's the competing objectives between the CIA and the Defense Department, the State Department and the CIA and the Defense Department, between any domestic policy agenda in the United States and the huge military complex. So
Yeah.
the capacity to do any of those things, I think Russia would have to say, well, your intentions are vague and unclear. Your capability to form an agreement is unclear. But on the first point, you may actually be sufficiently able to constrain the actions of your proxy in Ukraine and your loyal lieutenant on intelligence operations, Britain, to limit the difficulty for us. They may not expect too much, but if they can at least limit the difficulty for us, then presumably then Russia's military campaign will advance. And at some point, that rickety Ukrainian government is going to fall.
Collapse.
Yeah. Either through the military will say, oh, we've had enough, this is ridiculous, or whatever. I mean, there'll be a significant military defeat, strategic defeat. There'll be something happen and it will fall. And I think if the current Ukrainian government regime falls, I think that will also weaken Britain's role in the war as well, because they're so tied in with that. And I think that is an issue. So in a sense, I wonder if Russia's going through some sort of calculation, a bit like what Elbridge Colby says about China and Russia, which is strategic sequencing. So they have to use the current US government to the extent that because it's the principal sponsor of the war, the principal funder of the war, the principal intelligence network of the war. If they can limit its involvement in some way, then that will be they'll give them a lot of strategic advantages, and then it might lead to them having a party in Ukraine they can actually negotiate with. That's not a bunch of terrorists. I saw you quoted the President Putin's words on that. And perhaps it will also force a shift of position from Britain, because they're no longer providing the bodyguards for the regime. They're no longer have a head of intelligence services who's mad keen on running these sort of bizarre operations. MI6 will have to go somewhere else to play its James Bond games, and all that sort of thing. And then Europe, who I think ultimately needs to be brought into a structured process for peace for no other reason than, it's sort of like a real estate issue. It's position. Europe is next to Russia and next to Ukraine. So one way or the other, they're going to have to get involved. Britain, I don't think, needs to be so involved. I mean,
I think the reason Helmer
get Britain out, I think it will be improving.
Yeah, Europe had to get Britain out. I don't know, man. These people are lunatics, and the stuff, the jingoism that has been coming out of Europe, the stuff that they've been saying, like under the Biden administration, they effectively lied for years. And Europe doesn't have a First Amendment. I have an ex that lives in Europe. The stuff that she says is just lunatic, just full-blown lunatic. And it's because there is no other information source. The only information source that she has access to is what they give her. And so it's like, whereas in the US, okay, well, I can listen to RT. I can look at Sputnik. Even if they don't have it on our airways, I can look it up. You can look up pretty much any information. Even with the Washington Post and New York Times, they may lie, but you can find other sources to get some kind of context. Twitter, social media, meaning there's other streams of information in a way that is not true in Europe. And for example, Europe right now is bringing in terrorists into Europe. Like effectively, people were coming out of Syria that has now been bought into the government of Syria, that they're bringing into the military. That came out of the name of the place left me immediately. It'll come to me in a moment. The area of Syria that was effectively, even by the UN estimates, say had 40,000 terrorists that Donald Trump protected, which Angelani eventually takes over the government. Okay, you were saying now that you're importing these people into Europe. And it's like, why do you think that's a good idea? Like, I get that for Al-Jilani, okay, he was our guy, right? Donald Trump protected him. It'll come to me in a moment. The name is like right on the tip of my tongue. It'll come to me in a moment. Donald Trump protected him during his first term. When Syria finally collapses after decades of economic sanctions, after decades of these military campaigns where Obama, or for that matter even Bush, was paying money into trying to overthrow the government, it finally collapses after Turkey, Qatar, Israel, for God's sake, the US, after all of these countries finally have that one last push of paying off officials, having information campaigns and all of this stuff, the jig is up. Trump goes, shakes his hands. He's a tough guy, good looking, tough pass. Yeah, tough pass, chopping off heads. Idlib, that's the name of it. And they're importing people from Idlib, fundamentalists, into Europe. And you think to yourself, that seems insane. Like, meaning they do stuff that seems to be against the best interests of the public across the board. And they don't seem to care about what the public knows. And I don't even know if the public even knows what took place in Syria in regards to the US operations in Syria and everything else, and who they're importing into it, because the information flow is so constrained. And so it's like, do we really expect people who don't want to negotiate under any terms? I mean, merits is nuts. Callous, nuts. Root, nut. Like all of these people are fully into this mindset of, we are going to be fighting the Russians in 5 years. And so we need to build up our military. And so we need to feed Ukraine to the Russians for as long as we possibly can while we build up our military and everything else. And it's like, okay, are you really talking about feeding Europeans to the Russians? Is that really what you're thinking? And I get that there's some US war plans that talk about doing that. Effectively, yeah, we're going to diversify resources. We're going to deal with China. We're going to hand Europe over to the Russians, kind of like Roman Empire when they ran out of troops and they were overextended. So they had barbarians in order to fight some of their wars on their behalf and press them into the military. This seems outlandish. And it's like,
Yeah.
real quick, how do you bring people like that into any kind of negotiation when everything in their mind is, we don't want any negotiation?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think in a sense, you don't always get to choose your negotiating partner, and you also don't always get to do, especially if you're a government, you don't, you deal with the, they have a rather crude statement for it about it, some sort of sandwich,
Yeah.
but, you deal with the circumstances you have to deal with to some degree. And I think basically Europe will get into a situation where it is it has to make some sort of change. It really will need to actually deal with some different realities, and it will have let's say a situation not unlike Syria unfolds in Ukraine, where there's a sudden collapse of the regime. Zelensky flees somewhere or other, and they won't have the sort of ethnic cleansing type activities that happen, or the massacres of Alawites and things like that. I don't think so, but there will be a sort of ungoverned space there in Ukraine that both Europe and Russia will have to sort out. America is not going to help at all in this circumstance. And I do think it is difficult for Europe, but I don't think it's necessarily because they're sort of crazy or whatever. I think they've got a difficult problem around their political integration, but they also have a very difficult problem that, unlike most states, they basically have a separation between their domestic state and their defence. Right. They're actually not actually in control of their defence strategy. America is through NATO. Right. And I think as a result of that, you often get these kind of people who are as loyal to the Washington consensus as they are to the European consensus, driving Europe. And over the last, 10 or so years, there has been a partly US-driven and partly British-driven sort of enabling of the Poland and the sort of East European former Soviet states to be particularly, militant. I think if there is a collapse in Ukraine, you'll get a sort of a rebalancing of the voices within the European Union. Italy might take a different view. Spain will take a stronger view. France is in a political problem. There's still the problem of Germany, but Germany, Germany may not be such a military problem if it's also got some sort of economic solution in Ukraine as well. So, I think to some degree the situation, who knows? And I think that's part of the thing. Like, it's hard to actually work out how you sort of work your way through that situation when the situation isn't fully clear yet. Yeah. But I think there will be points at which the circumstances will change, and then Europe will have some much bigger issues to worry about than whether the Russian army is about to invade Berlin
That's
or
fair.
something, they will
I
have to
can't see.
work out, okay, what are we going to do for the Ukrainian refugees? What are we going to do about the reconstruction of Ukraine? How are we going to have some sort of capable governance in this society that's torn itself apart for the last 10 years? How is the European Union going to have to pay for this mess? This
Yeah.
mess that it's taken responsibility for, because the United States won't take responsibility for. And how are we actually going to craft a genuine European defence strategy rather than a American offense strategy? I mean, my view about Europe is they've basically been a launch pad for American schemes into Eurasia rather than a
Agreed.
they don't have a genuine defence strategy. They've given it up to both the strategy and the spending, if you like, to the United States.
Yeah.
So that's my and
I can see that.
ultimately there's value there, or there's potential for a different approach there. But I mean, it is going to be, there's a lot of water under the bridge,
Yeah.
a lot of a lot of humble pie that will need to be eaten, and that's part of the shock. But I mean, these shocks have happened before. It doesn't take that much to sack a foreign minister, really. I mean, let's get rid of Callas and let's go on a different path. We'll appoint, the Spanish foreign minister as the foreign minister for the EU,
Oh, that is going to be amazing.
away we go. Something
Look, I
like
would tell
that.
you, I can't see around corners, so fair enough.
Yeah.
I do know when Trump got elected and Trump decided, okay, we're going to try to make a deal. And the media flipped out. They lost it. Because that's the way we think here. Even when Joe Biden went to Geneva, and Geneva at the summit, Joe Biden was effectively like, hey, we need to get on the same page. We don't want to end up in a third world war. And the media is like, yeah, but did you punch Putin in the nuts? They were like, the stuff that they were saying was so outlandish. And when Joe Biden finally loses it, like he flips out and he's like, you don't understand. He's like screaming at this woman from the media. And the point he was trying to make to her is, you fundamentally have no responsibilities at all. You pick your kids up, you go take them to school, you play your Xbox. That is the width and breadth of your responsibilities in life. If we end up in a world war, this is a whole different, meaning the world I'm looking at is very different than you writing stuff on your blogs. That's different. And you are asking me these kind of insane questions, not quite getting the significance and the gravity of the reality that would happen if you got what you wanted. And, Trump, every so often, he says something very similar, where it's like, dude, I'm trying to prevent a third world war. I don't know if that's true, because, if you go to Russia and say, hey, we're going to put troops in Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, this is one of the parts of the deal. Okay, I have to question whether or not you're being serious about negotiating. But to your point, I can't see around corners. And as you say, things have happened before where there have been these kind of sea changes in the way that people think, and the way that people progress. So maybe. You mentioned John Helmer. John Helmer, Dancing with Bears, for people, if they want to know the outlet. I didn't read that about him saying Russia needs to prove that it's being serious. And Reznik, I think it was a Russian presenter, said a tactical nuke, which is like, no, don't say that. Don't say tactical nuke. Would make that point clear. And I got to be honest, I've thought that. And I am a anti-war lefty. And I found myself getting far harder over the course of either this war, some of the behavior that Western governments take, whether it's in Syria, knocking over a country. I mean, they're murdering Alawites as we speak, as a direct result of our policy in that country. Hundreds, 600, 700,000 dead Ukrainians, not to mention maybe 100, 200,000 dead Russians as a result of us pushing and pushing and pushing into a conflict that never needed to take place, and then lying about it all the way through. I can go back to Iraq, I can go back to Afghanistan. Brzezinski, forgot. You can name all of these people who life just didn't matter for. And up to this point, they've taken everything Putin has done. Pragmatism is weakness. And so I suppose that's where Helmer is coming in at. Give me your take on that. Is that too aggressive? I mean, as I pointed
No,
out,
no. Look, I remember early on in the war, I attended a sort of a kind of a meeting, a webinar sort of thing, led by a very distinguished Australian peace activist, Joe Camilleri, and like an international relations scholar as well. And Kishore Mahbubani was speaking, the former Singaporean diplomat, and a very, very distinguished former diplomat, and writes on international relations.
yeah,
And everyone in this event was saying, "Oh yeah, look, we know the United States provoked it, but it really isn't. It's really not okay for Russia. We know, and it's sort of like." Well, at what point do you say, well,
this
we
is
do
enough.
need to respond?
Yes,
And
look. I would tell you, I've had several people come on who takes that tact, and they're
yeah,
like, "Oh man, I just feel squishy about them," and I would
yeah,
point out, I don't.
yeah,
Where is the middle ground? Like
yeah,
either
yeah,
you allow them to put NATO on your border, or
mm,
you get involved,
mm,
and the latter is worse.
mm.
Like please continue. I'm glad you
So,
point that out. Yes.
so, and there is this issue. I mean, I think it's a real issue, particularly amongst the American elites. I mean, a lot of the American commentators have a go at the Europeans and whatnot, but I think there is this real sense of impunity in
Hmm.
America. Like, they can get away with anything, kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, but. Uh, so I feel that that shield of impunity needs to be breached, but it needs to be breached in a way that get gives a shock of defeat to the USA, particularly, but without provoking things too much,
Yeah.
without I mean, there's this thing of you need to defeat your enemy but not humiliate your enemy. I mean, if the United States had remembered that in 1991, it would have been a very different world. Over the last 30 years,
Yeah.
in relationship to the Soviet Union, and and whatever, it's the old war is politics or diplomacy conducted by other means. So whatever action Russia takes in relationship to this, it can't just express a feeling. It can't just be justified by a sense of reciprocity and that sort of thing, or righteous anger. But it actually needs to achieve a result. So, and what's the result Russia needs to achieve? It needs to achieve a result of actually, bringing this war to an end and ultimately negotiating, a better collective security arrangement, not just in Europe but also in across Eurasia, including with its strategic partner China in East Asia and the West Pacific. So, 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 I think John Helmer said that he felt that I might be. I mean, I'm doing it from memory, so I might be getting it wrong. But I think he said there is a strong sense amongst some of the Russian officials he might have spoken, or sources that he's spoken to, that there might need to be some kind of, significant surgical strike that will keep Trump focused on getting an outcome. Was, I
Well,
think,
I
the
would tell
kind of
you,
word that he said. So,
yeah.
like at some level, you'd sort of like to see, something go, wouldn't you? And
Yeah.
and some sort of decisive action, but it needs to be sufficient to sort of demonstrate, clarity of purpose, capability, but also an ability to control events and to help help the United States, who is the critical first part of the negotiation process, to move things towards the kind of outcome that Russia wants, and just
Agreed.
blowing up the house.
No, I agree. I agree. I agree. I don't want it to be just,
Even though, I mean, maybe we can sort of create a video game and play it all in a few years' time.
No, fair enough. I agree. And by the way, just to be clear, I'm not saying, they should go on a killing spree, and nor am I saying it should be just a random thing. I guess what I'm getting at is every pragmatic action is looked upon as, well, they're just weak. And I'll take another thing, China, the same thing with China, right? Like you get the US putting troops in Taiwan. Okay, that's pretty provocative, but the US thinks we can do it, no issue. Salami slicing, the one China policy, as you pointed out, Hegseth going to Shangri-La and given effectively a speech of declaration of war. I mean, because from China's point of view, if you're trying to pull Taiwan away, that's effectively pulling apart off a leg or part of China, regardless of how they see themselves. That takes them back to Hong Kong and this kind of gunboat diplomacy that the Brits and the US effectively were involved in, putting opium all throughout the country. And so in their heads, that's a red line. And yet, oblivious, completely oblivious. Either one or two things, either oblivious or intentionally goading them into a war, just like they goaded Ukraine into that war. And so it's like, how do you break this sense of impunity? And during the Soviet Union era, I don't think they had the sense of impunity. I just don't get the sense they understood the world could end tomorrow. And that's not their take today.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, although, I guess it's strange, isn't it? I mean, the only state ever to use nuclear weapons or, atomic weapons against is the United States. They've never apologized, even to this day, to it. And you get politicians like Lindsey Graham, you get lunatics like ideologically enthusiastic people like Steve Bannon, who support and say it was the right thing to do. In fact, Lindsey Graham said if it was right for us to use nuclear weapons against Japan, then why can't Israel use nuclear weapons against Gaza or Iran or whatever?
Exactly.
And you think, I mean, I don't. Presumably, a lot of people in America are watching your show. I don't want to have a go at Americans, but people around the world watch that and they just feel, they just say, this is unacceptable.
That's not an abnormal point of view in America. I'm just telling you, that is not an abnormal point of view in the States, especially about many of these neocons like Graham, McCain, et cetera. You go down the list.
Yeah. So it is scary, and it's a real. It's got to be a real dilemma for China, and it's got to be a dilemma for Japan. It's got to be a dilemma for Korea. It's got to be a dilemma for all the countries around the world. Looking at this divided American government that, harbors people with, reckless plans that, basically boil down to, world domination.
Real quick, to interrupt before I have to let you go.
Yeah.
That's something that you hit upon that I was fascinated by. You're right. We have a divided government, but that was kind of the point initially. The thought was, okay, we have, you don't want power consolidated in one spot, because if you do, then you have no challenge to that power structure. So we want to break it up into three parts, but then it gets subdivided into private enterprise, and all of these things have their own interests. And to your point, all of this stuff was a hypothesis. It wasn't like this was, this is exactly the way correct government is. It was a hypothesis. Like when they started this country, they started under this kind of theory. Is that theory wrong? I mean, is that what we're looking at? Is it like the falling apart of a hypothesis as that Western shot, just to go back to where we started?
I don't think the theory is necessarily, it's all based on Montesquieu and separation of powers and all that sort of thing. But and Montesquieu himself sort of derived it from Britain to some degree, but he also misinterpreted the nature of, because there's not such a strict separation of the different arms of government in Britain, and so I think part of the problem is there is a tendency, as an outside observer, amongst American political analysts and thinkers, to think that the American Constitution is God's gift to the world.
Yes,
and
it's the Bible.
it's just one pretty now old, rickety, dysfunctional set of institutions and practices that doesn't necessarily really fully describe the real functioning of power, like Aaron Good's written about, the state of exception and all that sort of I don't like the deep state term, but the role of the security agencies, the national security state, and all that sort of thing. So I think it's not the theory that's necessarily the problem. It's realizing that, everywhere around the world implements some form of separation of powers. America is not unique in that.
Yeah.
What America has done is gone to the extreme end of the spectrum in terms of division, and it has this very strong sort of anti-state ideology, that has also meant that, you can't do things like, universal health care. It can't do things like a basic social security system. It sort of cripples itself to some degree by its belief in the sense that the founders got it right back in the 1780s.
They nailed
and
it.
The last no one's learned anything about how to conduct governments in the last 250 years.
Jeff, you are fantastic, man. I have to bring you back. I love these conversations, by the way.
So do I.
am enamored by these conversations. Thank you for this. I really do. Jeff Rich, he is an author, historian, podcaster who worked for 33 years. That is an astonishing amount of time in government. He's now retired, but he currently lives in Melbourne, Australia. Jeff has spent a lifetime of studying history and how knowledge of historical currents can help context to a changing world. You can find Jeff on YouTube at The Burning Archive. By the way, it is a fantastic channel.
Thank you.
Definitely check it out. It is a fantastic channel. You can find him on Substack at jeffrich.substack.com. One more thing, Jeff, should I call you Dr. Rich? You told me you were a PhD.
Yeah. Well, yes, I guess. Strictly speaking, you can do that, but
Well, it's not strictly speaking, you earned it.
I always insist my children call me Dr. Rich. No.
I think okay.
No.
Still. You have a fantastic night, man. Thank you for this. I really appreciate it.
Fantastic.
Have a good one.